Distinguished participants, I am pleased to note that on the 17th and 18th November 2020, under the auspices of the African Union, the inaugural Agriculture and Food Security Dialogue Platform, dubbed Cultivate Africa, is finally going to take place. The platform is being realized following a brilliant concept thanks to Hallpax, who are partnering with us in organizing and facilitating this event. Since then, it has taken us months of planning and consultations. Marked under the theme Galvanizing Partnership for Promoting Resilient Agriculture and Food System in Africa in the shadow of COVID-19 pandemic. The Cultivate Africa Dialogue 1 for Eastern and Southern Africa has been configured as a response to spur action towards addressing the potential adverse effects of the raging COVID-19 pandemic, as highlighted in the April 16, 2020 Declaration of Ministers of Agriculture. The declaration called for the development of short, medium, and long-term intervention to ensure food availability and access all year round for Africa, especially the vulnerable and resource poor. Taking advantage of the world's leading virtual event platform and the African Union convening vantage, the Cultivate Africa First Dialogue is intended to pull together a broad range of stakeholders operating in the African agriculture and food security space, independently planned, without any donor and investors' vested interests. The dialogue is expected to serve as a safe and neutral ground for dialogue and an opportunity to extract the best of partnership, free exchange of views by different partners, especially from the civil society organization and the private sector, and which are stakeholders in agriculture, agribusiness, sustainable environment, natural resources, and food and nutrition security. The dialogue will build on the considerable learning and experience of other initiatives of the intersection of African agriculture and COVID-19, combining this with original analysis, insights, and ideas to develop solutions that overcomes challenges posed by the current pandemic, as well as long-term challenges facing the sector, including the climate change catastrophe. The output from the dialogue will be made available to the African Union policy organs and platforms. The planners of the event will endeavor to deliberately compile the proceeding of the dialogue and generate sentences to inform policy and action. It is through such expert engagement that we are able to identify opportunities and capacity that are available, and the African Union Commission and our partners can harness in our quest to transform agriculture and meeting the Sustainable Development Goal and indeed our Agenda 2063. It is also expected that policy experts will use the outcome of the dialogue to develop and compiling cases for investment in the sector. It is our hope that the success of Cultivate Africa Dialogue 1 will motivate organization of future similar dialogues for the other regions of Africa, We hope to learn and build from the format and power of the virtual engagement to foster the future of our agriculture and food system. Welcome to Cultivate Africa Dialogue 1, and thank you for expressing interest to participate in it.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. It is an honor to have you all join us at Cultivate Africa. Now, more than ever, we have realized the importance of coming together and making joint efforts to solve the challenges ahead of us. While Cultivate Africa is just a gathering for 2 days, we hope the conversations, networking, and outcome to be long-lasting for all of you, especially for farmers and their families. We all come from farmers' families in Africa. I remember my great-grandfather looking up to the sky and inspecting weather and making analysis on how it could impact the crop production that season. Now farmers like my great-grandfather have one more challenge on their plate, the impact of a pandemic. As a child, I've always wondered why my great-grandfather cared so much about the weather. He had retired and was no longer living on a farm at that time. Through time, I realized it's a farmer's character to care about others. They not only worry about feeding their own families, but carry the heavy burden of feeding us all. In the course of the next 2 days, think about farmers like my great-grandfather, like your great-grandparents and grandparents. We stand on their shoulders to be who we are. When we approached the African Union Commission with an idea of a dialogue on the impact of the pandemic on farmers, they were very quick to respond and shape what is now Cultivate Africa. It is a great testament for our continent when the African Union Commission partners with a startup company like Hallpax, run by someone as young as myself. I would like to thank the African Union Commission, Department of Rural Economy and Agriculture for partnering with us and supporting Cultivate Africa full-heartedly. I would like to also thank our partners and side event hosts for joining us and shaping the agenda, and the team at Hallpax that have worked behind the scene to make Cultivate Africa a reality. Let us try to think like a farmer, beyond our own families, to the nation at large. Enjoy the conversations, make new partners and friends, enjoy Cultivate Africa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining today. My name is Rikin Gandhi, Executive Director of Digital Green. Agricultural transformation is well underway across the continent, and it's inspiring to see it firsthand. Today, farmers see an extension agent demonstrating a new practice, receive automated calls from their local cooperative with market price information, and receive weather forecasts directly on their smartphones. Data can be power for farmers, but many of us collect data that remains locked up and is just kept for our own individual reporting or programmatic purposes. Too often, even farmers themselves can't access their own data. An individual data point may seem like it has little value, from monitoring data on our programs, to inventory data on the stock of inputs in our shops, to certification standards for the crops that we purchase. But taken together, this data has the power of connecting the dots to maximize our collective impact. Just like roads and electricity, data can serve as infrastructure to catalyze the next generation of agri-tech innovations in Africa. Take, for example, how a buyer of wheat may be willing to offer a higher price if she knew that the farmers that she was sourcing from had planted quality seed and had followed practices that boosted flour extraction rates. An extension agent may have that information, but it's difficult to expect an extension agent to know why she should share it, let alone to know how she would even do so in the first place. That gets further complicated when data is stored in different formats across different databases and when you don't know which data you can reliably trust. On the other hand, a farmer is often best positioned to validate her own data and to know who she wants to share her data with. That's what government and the broader agricultural sector now needs to enable, to flip how data is extracted from farmers today and stored in fragmented silos, and instead empower farmers to control and share their own data in a unified way on their own terms. By sharing data between two or more organizations, farmers can then get access to quality and customized services that are greater than the sum of their individual parts. At Digital Green, for instance, we work with the Ministry of Agriculture and 4 regional bureaus of agriculture in Ethiopia to use videos that are by and for farmers to share best practices. As we do so, development agents collect data on what videos individual farmers watch, their feedback and questions, and what practices they apply on their farms. We've linked that data with the Agriculture Transformation Agency's 8028 Farmer Hotline so that farmers can listen to the same advice that they watched during a video screening on their phones. But that was only made possible because Digital Green and the ATA had established a partnership between ourselves. What if farmers were able to access their own data that Digital Green had collected and decided for themselves that they wanted to share it with ATA so they didn't have to re-register themselves on 8028 or vice versa? As the agriculture and telecom sectors continue to liberalize and expand across Africa, we need to co-create a digital platform that we call FarmStack to serve as the rails for countless applications across the agricultural value chain that we can't even begin to imagine what the possibilities might be for a growing ecosystem of government, NGO, and private sector actors to co-create. I'm personally most looking forward to seeing what ideas the farmers themselves come up with as they take control of their own data. We could see applications ranging from marketplaces that link farmers to buyers, banks that develop credit scores to offer agricultural finance, precision agricultural startups that provide site-specific advisories, and more. Imagine the potential for enabling a whole new sector of rural employment that most critically ensures that farmers are at the center and where the potential is unleashed as entrepreneurs having the capacity and choice to determine who they engage with. To take this ambitious mandate forward, we need to start by demonstrating the promise of what this could concretely enable. We need to design the interventions in partnership with those in the field and working backward from the farming communities themselves. And behind the scenes, we need to build this FarmStack open architecture of data standards that provides the necessary safeguards to protect the interests of farmers and the organizations that work with them alike to be the ones to decide who they share what with. This will enable a wide variety of data systems to talk to one another and seamlessly coordinate. This public infrastructure will only be successful when the economic value of everybody that uses it exceeds the value of creating it in the first place. The architecture needs to be robust to the rapid pace of technology and agricultural change taking place, and we need to co-create this in an open source manner while giving organizations and individuals the control to decide what they want to share and make public and what they want to keep private or proprietary. Africa can be pioneers in developing and deploying this FarmStack digital platform for agriculture to achieve impact at scale, not just for farmers on the continent, but for those worldwide as well. Even as much will inevitably change over time, we know that there are some things that will remain the same. Farmers, especially those most marginalized like women and youth, will undoubtedly want to earn more and consume less for having and reaping their greatest harvest. Enabling their aspirations will remain our benchmark of success. I want to thank the African Union for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today. It is a real privilege to be on this journey together with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and this opportunity to address this meeting. Africa's economies, and especially Africa's poor, are being hard hit by the global COVID-19 pandemic. We, and with we I mean my team at the International Food Policy Research Institute, estimate that because of COVID-19, between 50 and 80 million more Africans could fall into poverty and food insecurity this year. This is not only tragic, but it's also paradoxical. It's paradoxical because thus far Africa has been the least affected region where it comes to the spread of the disease itself. It seems even more paradoxical considering that we also expect agri-food production in the region to increase this year. So why this adverse impact on food security? First and foremost, the impact is felt because of the spillover effects of the global recession provoked by the lockdowns and the social distancing measures taken to contain the spread of COVID-19. Africa is hurt especially hard because of its high reliance on primary exports, for which the demand has fallen and prices have declined. Remittance incomes have also dried up. Lower foreign exchange earnings are limiting food imports and hence threaten food security for many. Second, even though overall agri-food production is set to expand this year, many countries have suffered or are still suffering from food supply disruptions caused by COVID-19. Before I get to those, let me first emphasize that while we've seen disruptions in food supply chains worldwide, overall global food supply chains have held up quite well, and no global food scarcity has emerged. This holds especially for key staple foods traded internationally, such as maize, wheat, rice, and soybeans. Yet, as said, there have been major supply disruptions, especially markets for perishable foods. Nigeria closed many markets for fresh foods during the pandemic, causing food losses and problems of access to food for many. Also, elsewhere in Africa, we have seen disruptions, for instance, where curfews have restricted the overnight transport of fruits, vegetables, and meats. Lacking cold storage and cold transportation, such foods are now being transported in the open air and heat during the day, and likewise causing food losses. Together with reduced food import capacity, such supply disruptions have caused food prices to rise, and overall food prices are up by 15% or more in Ethiopia, Rwanda, Liberia, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, just to mention a few cases. Food price increases have not been as steep and significant in all countries, but we do see almost everywhere that the prices of the more nutrient-rich foods, such as fruits, vegetables, meats, and dairy products, they do have increased sharply. As a result, we estimate that an additional 120 and 130 million Africans will no longer be able to afford a minimum nutrition adequate diet because of these price effects caused by the COVID-19 recession and the supply disruptions. In short, poverty and food insecurity are set to increase dramatically in Africa this year, even as the region thus far seems to have more limited spread of the pandemic itself. Equally worrisome is that hundreds of millions are shifting to cheaper diets, that is, they're eating relatively more calorie-rich foods, such as basic grains and low-quality processed foods, and less of more expensive nutrient-rich foods. As a result, many more people will suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. So we should see also an increased amount of child stunting, causing longer-term setbacks to human development and with it to economic development throughout the region. So what can and should be done to mitigate these impacts? It would be pretentious for me to present a detailed plan in just a few minutes. So let me just suggest a few directions that would seem critical as immediate responses and how those could be aligned with longer-term responses. First of all, the region would be helped by more and even stronger economic stimulus in high-income countries than those countries have already provided. This will help mitigate the adverse spillover effects of their recession on food security in Africa. Second, some of that stimulus could go as direct additional financial support. Will have more fiscal space to expand social safety nets and nutrition and health programs to facilitate continued smooth functioning of food supply chains to minimize further disruptions and increase food import capacity, as well as reactivate their economies more generally. But Africa and the entire world must rebuild better. Let us not forget that the challenges facing global food system sustainability before COVID-19, those challenges have not gone away. satisfying global food demand and increasing global food demand, which is projected to increase by at least 30% over the next 10 to 20 years, the bulk of that demand will materialize in developing countries, mostly in Africa and South Asia. This increasing food demand will have to be satisfied under severe environmental constraints, as the world has pushed food systems already to its planetary boundaries. It's painfully visible at the severe degree of loss of biodiversity, land degradation, and increasing water scarcity. Climate change is exacerbating these environmental challenges, and food systems themselves contribute about 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, making them both the culprit and the victim of the consequences of climate change. And lastly, already before COVID-19, the world was not on track to meet the goal of ending hunger by 2030. COVID-19 is causing much larger setbacks. These are huge challenges to rebuild better beyond COVID-19. Most critical for Africa will be to invest massively in resilient and more inclusive food systems. The first big step, which as mentioned, should already be part of the immediate response, is to facilitate investments into much better integrated supply chains. I already mentioned the weak spots such as inadequacies in cool transportation, storage, adequate packaging, and processing capacity. Governments can help by prioritizing investments in rural infrastructure, especially roads, energy, communications infrastructure. These are essential for the many small-scale businesses throughout the food supply chain so they can thrive and for farmers to gain better access to markets. It would also facilitate greater use of digital technologies that can help raise food sector productivity. During COVID-19, we have seen a huge expansion of e-commerce and the use of digital technology in the food sector. It is providing new and better income and employment opportunities for farmers and small-scale businesses. This is a trend that is here to stay, and Africa should jump on this bandwagon. Second, much deeper trade integration within the region has enormous potential for job creation. This holds in particular for agriculture and food products, for which there's enormous scope for building on regional markets. Tapping better into this potential will promote economic growth, more diverse food supply, and hence greater food system resilience. Let me just point at our latest Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor, which indicates how these opportunities could be leveraged in the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And last but not least, much more investment and policy incentives should focus on research and development and extension services to help improve the efficiency and climate resilience of the key crops important to Africa's food basket. The key priority here would be to look beyond the traditional staple foods and focus on better technologies for sustainable production of more nutritious foods. This will be essential to make nutrition adequate diets affordable to all of Africa's population. In conclusion, we're not out of the woods yet when it comes to COVID-19. Far from it. A major food crisis could still emerge in Africa, and current trends remain worrisome. We need much stronger, internationally concerted efforts to stave off this risk, but we should also aim to do so with a focus on creating resilient food sectors in Africa, such that these can meet today's and tomorrow's existentialist challenges. We must build back better. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pierre Ferrari. I'm President and CEO of Heifer International. I'm absolutely delighted to be here to participate in the Cultivate Africa conference. I think it's a critical issue. I thought I'd begin with not an extensive explanation of the problem. I think most of the audience is very familiar with the hundreds, if not millions of farmers that are, I think, suffering from poor productivity, are malnourished, basically run their farms with rain-fed agriculture, which, as we all know, is very low productivity and not open to much technological change. So there's a lot of changes to happen if Africa is going to feed itself, which I think is one of the goals that we should have. We know that Africa imports an enormous proportion of the food it eats, 80% of the tomatoes it consumes. That's absurd when you think about the vast numbers of farmers that could be cultivating tomatoes and producing it so as to be processed and not an import substitute, essentially, would be the target. So how do we do all that? And what is really the problem? I think much of the approach that's been suggested through the various development organizations, whether it be at the national level or the international global level, has to do with economics. How do we provide the right kind of incentives? How do we provide the right kind of technology? Is the new technologies of digital technology and market access, financial access, will that solve the problem? We think those things are important. There's no question that technology of one sort or another will be helpful to improve productivity and impact, and of course, import substitution, and create a condition so that these large numbers of people can feed themselves nutritious foods. However, HEFA approaches this a little bit differently. We recognize the economics of the problem, but what's not been recognized well enough is the social and psychological issues associated with development, associated specifically with farming development. How do we actually find ways to motivate individuals and groups, villages, etc., to adopt the right kind of technologies and the right kind of mindset with which change can happen? And we have a particular approach we call values-based holistic community development, which recognizes that many of these communities are actually racked by social and psychological difficulties that prevent them from actually doing the kind of work that they would like to do. These communities are generally suffering from some level of hopelessness, and how do we move them into a state of hopefulness, one where they will become self-reliant, accountable to themselves, and productive, and actually adopt new practices to move them forward into self-reliance. That particular aspect, that social psychology, is a critical, basic, foundational element of success. Now, donors have generally been reluctant to fund that kind of activity, but we have a substantial amount of data and many decades of experience that without doing that foundational work, that social psychological work and individual psychological work to shift people into believing they are not prey to systems that are exploiting them, that they have agency with which to escape poverty, hunger, misery, etc. If that doesn't happen, just to repeat myself, I don't think a lot of interventions actually work, and we have a lot of evidence for that. So so if you think about how we as a group, what kind of narrative do we follow? We are generally following a narrative organized and structured by economists who operate at a level of financial incentives mostly. We think the world and the development world needs sociologists and psychologists. That is the basic from which change can happen. And again, we can go into details later. We'd be glad to discuss this at length. But unless that particular component and aspect of development is recognized and well-funded, we think that a lot of the hopes that we have for the development of Cultivate Africa will fail. I realize that what I'm saying may be somewhat controversial, but I hope that's helpful for everyone to discuss and consider. Thank you very much.
Cultivate Africa can bring us together to build resilience and sustainable food systems in Africa as we come out of this COVID-19 crisis. Let me share with you today why I think this is so important. Poverty and hunger remain global challenges. 800 million people suffer from hunger or malnutrition. 1 out of 10 people live in extreme poverty. There's a lot of good news to celebrate. The good news is that extreme poverty has gone down a lot, from 36% in 1990 to less than 10% today. But that's still too high, and it's harder and harder to reach those left behind, especially as many of those left behind live in war zones or areas plagued by conflict. Food insecurity and poverty are most severe among rural populations, rural marginalized groups, including women and young people. Around 60% of the world's poorest people work in agriculture, and the overwhelming majority of those work on small farms. This includes more than 2 billion small producer, farm laborers, rural workers and their families. And let's not forget that women are major contributors to agriculture, but face more barriers than men do. Africa has huge potential, but also faces large challenges. Even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Africa was more food insecure than the rest of the world. Yet Africa has a high potential to raise its farm productivity because land and water resources are still largely untapped. Only 4% of arable land in Africa is irrigated. About 2/3 of Africans live in rural and remote areas, and the average farm size is just 2.4 hectares. This means that African smallholder farmers generate the bulk of the continent's food. The African population is growing fast, and by 2015, Africa must feed 1.5 billion more people than it feeds today. I believe that the 21st century is Africa's century. Africa is the young continent. Each year, more than 12 million youth enter the labor market. We often hear about that as if it's a problem, but it's a huge opportunity. Feeding Africa will require bolstering the entrepreneurship and the innovation that young Africans can bring. It will require us to make agriculture a cool profession, to keep the young in rural areas, and to offer them an opportunity to have a livelihood and a career in food systems. The COVID pandemic is putting us back decades in ending poverty. The direct effects from the lockdowns on poor people were enormous. Staying at home when you work the land instead of having an office job and you don't have savings means that you lose your livelihood and that soon you will go hungry. Supply chains were disrupted as borders closed, and migrant workers were laid off and did no longer send money, remittances to their families in their home countries. But the effects of the economic downturn that results from the COVID-19 could even be bigger. There are still wide ranges of estimates. The economic crisis might push 100 million people into poverty, or if it lasts longer, it might be 500 million people that are pushed into poverty. COVID sets the fight against poverty back by 3 decades. I have been working on ending poverty my whole career. I've been working on it for the past 25 years, and it pains me deeply that the world might soon be where it was when I started working on this. Imagine that you cannot get food, you cannot get cash, you cannot get work. I think often about the many women that I've met in the past years in Africa that proudly showed me their farm or the enterprise they'd built up. I think about Kelem Shefera, a lady horticulture farmer I met in Ethiopia last year. I think about the young entrepreneurs who sell solar panels to rural communities in Cameroon. I think about the women groups that I met in Mali that were increasing their milk production of their cows to feed their children. Where are they today? Are these power girls, these smart women entrepreneurs, still thriving? Or are their activities, their livelihoods and their families suffering in this global crisis? The COVID pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of our food systems. COVID threatens the life of people directly through the virus itself and through malnutrition and hunger. But the COVID crisis also threatens the livelihood of people around the world. COVID highlights the interconnectedness of global economies. It highlights the interconnectedness of people, the planet and prosperity. And more than all, it highlights the need for global solidarity. We need to aim for sustainable rural transformation, and we need to focus on three things. First, we need to feed the hungry. We need to fight malnourishment and improve healthier diets. Rural transformation needs to ensure that all women, men, girls and boys are fed well. Second, we need to provide livelihood for those who produce our food. Farmers cannot go hungry themselves. And third, we need to make sure we use the earth in a sustainable and responsible way. We need to make sure the agricultural practices do not harm our planet and that they're resilient against climate change. Let me share how IFAD is responding to the COVID crisis. We have repurposed ongoing projects to respond to urgent COVID needs in the countries we work in. For example, in Tunisia, we agreed with the government that part of the funds of an IFAD finance project could be used to support a nutrition program for children who are no longer getting school meals because the school closed. This is one of many examples. We also established the Rural Poor Stimulus Facilities to mobilize additional resources to support governments in responding to the COVID-19 crisis. We focus on four main areas: inputs for production, such as seeds and farm infrastructure, access to markets, rural financing services, and agriculture-related information through digital services. These areas are actually well aligned with the tracks for discussions over those 2 days of Cultivate Africa. An African proverb says that if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. We need to go together on this. I started by telling you that Cultivate Africa can bring us together to build resilience and sustainable food systems in Africa as we come out of this COVID-19 crisis. Nobody can do this alone. No institution can do this alone. No country can do this alone. We need to stick together. Governments are in the lead. We need to galvanize the power of entrepreneurs and investors, as agriculture and food production is essentially a private activity. From multinational to smallholders, all have a role to play. We need civil society to give communities a voice, and we need them for their local know-how. Multilaterals and donors have an important role to play. Rich countries and financiers need to be sensible in rescheduling loan payments, so they free up public resources for governments in poor countries to invest. Researchers will bring us innovation and evaluate what works. We need women and men, we need young and old, we need economists, engineers, agronomists, financial types and gender specialists. We need farmers. We need all of us. Most of all, we need to learn from smallholder farmers, from fishers, pastoralists, mothers, young people, indigenous people, chefs, market owners, and all others who are part of food systems, as producers, as processors, preparers, and consumers. Everybody is part of a food system, and everybody can join in taking action to create the change we need. That's the beauty of Cultivate Africa. Cultivate Africa does just that. It brings us together to build resilience and sustainable food systems. The creativity of the response must match the unique nature of the crisis. The magnitude of our response must match the scale of the crisis. I encourage all of us to actively participate in the discussions over the coming 2 days and to reach a consensus on how we can work in partnership. To recover from the corona crisis, business as usual is not an option. We need to transform our food systems. The COVID-19 crisis can serve as a turning point to rebalance and transform our food systems, to make them more inclusive, more sustainable, more equitable and more resilient. Let's get to work.